Okay, everybody, we're continuing on with our talk of the Civil War, and certain things become clear after Gettysburg. Let's make sure that this is actually recording first, huh? Should we do that? Looks like it is. Let's hope so, 'cause I don't want to waste all this time. Anyway, you don't need to see me. So after Gettysburg, right? Momentum swings to the side of the Union. And this momentum should be looked at as a combination of military success and also public opinion. So let's make a list of things that are important for the North to win this war. Like what's going on in the North's favor. Here we are. So first, industrial production and capacity. And as we said, the South did well despite the lack of parity in this region, but the North had more banking, labor capacity, and industry in general. Jefferson Davis was not on par with Abraham Lincoln as far as political savvy. Jefferson Davis was a soldier. Um, he was not, he made mistakes. For example, after the fall of Chattanooga, Tennessee, he reappointed General Bragg, who received a vote of no confidence from the rest of the Confederate generals. The CSA was handicapped by states' rights and all its implications. So the Union had an existing political culture and party system, and Lincoln used the partisanship to motivate, to strategize his base, and he transformed the role of government through this. Diplomacy, and we've talked about that, and the possibilities of the Union. If the Union were fighting a real British and Confederate army, or on a second front with British coming down from Canada. Military leadership, you have General Grant, but also Sherman, Sheridan, and Thomas. They all put into effect something like Scott's Anaconda Plan, war on multiple fronts. And the corollary here is that General Lee was unmatched as far as other Confederate generals, but he was like the whole weight of the war was on this one person. And finally, emancipation and total war. So unconditional surrender became the goal of the war. And so what does this mean for the Confederacy? A war on the resources, transportation, society, cities, people in general, the population, and of course, slavery, their labor system, their source of wealth. And Sherman was dead set on Georgia at this point. So, yeah, it's a kind of a fuzzy photograph, isn't it? But we mentioned the shifting momentum, and when we try to measure the importance of Gettysburg, it's important as the military losses for Lee and the Confederacy, and the role of that victory for the Union, and shifting Lincoln even more into the emancipationist camp, and a belief in total war to defeat the Confederacy. And the evidence for this was the legendary speech that you've all heard of, November of 1862, commemorating the battlefield, being 7 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And Lincoln put the battle and the victims of that battle in the context of the founders' struggle. Quote, "The world can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us," and so on. New birth of freedom for the new nation, right? So this is not the same Lincoln who was stuck on unionism for the past 5 or so years. Charles Sumner declared that the world, quote, "will never cease to remember Lincoln's Gettysburg Address." The battle itself was less important than the speech almost, except for those who lost their lives, of course. And Sumner's observation provides the perfect moment to look beyond the battlefield and look at political and economic questions that face the US and the Confederacy. These two societies both dealt with significant political problems, but they handled them very differently. The US maintained a vigorous two-party political culture and political system, and is complete with closely contested presidential election of 1864. We'll get to that later. And the CSA, on the other hand, moved away from formal party divisions, but still had a complex political situation. The economies differences are very stark. As almost all of the fighting happened in the South, the economic impact of the war was much more severe here in the South. The war dealt several blows to agricultural production, the transportation network of the South. The result was serious economic and material hardship for the people of the South. And the story in the North is basically the exact opposite. The Northern economy proved that it could both supply its army and make many of the Northern population wealthy. War makes you rich, remember? We talked about this earlier when we used to meet. The Republican-dominated Congress passed legislation that was designed to make the nation a great industrial and commercial power. So on the Confederate home front, war brought enormous dislocations of the people. Dramatic changes affected people in just about every corner of the Confederacy. The war was a reality for most people on a daily basis. Confederates struggled to keep their armies in the field and watched their economy just melt. Their political system cracked, and they suffered shortages of almost everything needed for daily life. And disaffection with the war increased as the years went on. Tens of thousands of Confederate civilians became refugees, basically, as U.S. armies moved ever deeper into the southern interior. And so, Confederate politics. Now, early in the war, the CSA saw a period of nearly complete consensus. They were united people. Politicians of all stripes believed it was important to come together and maintain a united front if they were going to win this war. And the founders of the CSA tried to avoid party politics. They didn't want factions. They wanted to go back to the model of the founding fathers, many of whom believed that parties were a cancer on a Republican political system. This period of getting along didn't really last. Normal divides within the political system of the South quickly came back into play. Advocates for states' rights stood up against those who were willing to tolerate a more powerful central government in order to win the war. Davis's government took much more power than the pre-war Southerners would have been comfortable with. They levied taxes, imposed conscription, and otherwise pushed these so-called states' rights aside. The irony, of course, that the South was moved into this direction before the North. This seemed to go against everything the CSA was about, right? And the legends we've heard still today. And water break. And in terms of government, Confederate Congress proved to be a pretty weak political body, but Davis himself was a somewhat strong leader. He had a good grasp of the military situation, since he himself was a military man, went to West Point, and overall he did what he could, but he was not very popular. He did not share Lincoln's ability to make a connection with the people and to explain in accessible and moving ways what the war was about. Confederacy never had parties by name, but they had factions that developed around pro and anti-Davis sentiments. And this came down to personal feelings as well as ideological issues about the size and the strength of government. So the war created a divided political situation here, and the Southern economy was even worse. So one thing, the war was a severe blow to the already shaky, sketchy Southern transportation network. The result was that a big problem for the CSA was not so much for producing food, but it was transporting and distributing that food. The Union armies destroyed the railroads that the CSA just couldn't replace. It couldn't build its own rails. It couldn't build its own locomotives. And this was one of the places where the underdeveloped, not sufficiently diverse Southern economy was haunted, right? There severe shortages and high inflation made the prices of everyday necessities much too expensive for most people. Food riots across the Confederacy, most famously in Richmond in 1863. Shortages, again, were mainly caused by problems of transportation. And given such condition, thousands of letters from soldiers' wives urged their husbands to desert the army and come home and take care of the family. Historians of the war argue that this kind of hardship confronting most Confederates undermined the Southern war effort, morale, opposition to the draft, and sad, pathetic letters coming from home had a negative impact on the ability to mount a national resistance. Refugees from Union advances contributed more chaos. Refugees crowded narrow roads, jammed everything they had into trains and wagons, went off to larger cities. So like Richmond's population swelled from about 40,000 people to 100,000 people by the end of the war. People were crammed in makeshift housing. While some people may have been welcome at first, they became a burden in places where people were already having a hard time feeding and taking care of themselves and their families. When the war was over, refugees often returned to completely destroyed homes and towns. So the war brought to the Confederacy things that no other segment of the country has ever known: wholesale destruction, property, military occupations, defeat on a grand scale, and the displacement of thousands of citizens. These are experiences common to almost every nation in the world, but it's only instance in American history of this happening. I don't know, maybe we could argue Hurricane Katrina now. I would say that, yeah, Hurricane Katrina was a mass displacement of a large portion of the population, but I don't think it's proper to refer to people from the New Orleans region or anywhere affected as a refugee, being that they were in their home country. But that's a total aside here. Anyway, these people are struggling with deteriorating political systems, a shattered economy, and the U.S. President of the U.S. Army is coming in. Confederates are just disenchanted with this whole idea, this experiment. And remarkable thing is that people in the South remained loyal, though, for such a long time. And most Confederates didn't actually become all that disenchanted. The Northern home front presented a very different story. Very little dislocation. People's routine were really interrupted by the war in ways it was in the Confederacy. That's a big difference. War didn't touch the Northern civilian population as in ways that it did Southern population. And the two-party system continued as it had before, and the economy prospered and in fact moved into a new phase of industrial and commercial capitalism. So the two-party system was vital over the course of the war, as I said. The Republican Party did much to enact a political program that it had in mind, that it wanted to carry out since at least the 1850s, to solidify its position in power, even though there were different branches of this Republican Party. They all still were coming together for this. So the radical Republicans, who were ahead of their time in thinking about African Americans and favored a harsh prosecution of the war. These radicals were gaining more strength and more of a voice. And Lincoln, who was the most prominent among the more moderate Republicans, kind of moved to the left a little bit, closer to the radicals over time. And Democrats were split into two main factions. Here, let me put that back here. There was the war Democrats, we'll just call them, people who supported the war effort, supported Lincoln administration, etc., but who opposed Republican domestic legislation. And there were peace Democrats. The second faction was willing to consider a lenient peace for the CSA and oppose Lincoln on almost everything. The Copperheads were the most aggressive of the peace Democrats. They were especially strong in the southern parts of the Midwest and among the Irish in the northeastern cities. The southern parts of the Midwest, that document never mind, we'll skip that. I'm going to have you read something, but we didn't do that. The Democratic Party, though, was saying mostly detested Republican ideas. They hated the moral stands on issues such as slavery and race, alcohol, because many Republicans favored restrictions on the sales of alcohol, which Democrats did not like. They vigorously opposed emancipation and thought that the war should be just about the Union, not about emancipation. Many Democrats, I'll say most, had very racist views, and they were most heated about this issue of Black freedom, emancipation. And when the war was going poorly for the North, Copperheads enjoyed their greatest strengths. Their strongest point was in the 1863, early summer, criticisms of taxes, drafts, attack on civil liberties, etc. All these things resonated at those moments, right? And when the war was going well, support dropped for them. When the election of 1864 was essential for the Republicans, it was a referendum on the war, on emancipation, and the war was going very poorly for the North in the spring and summer of 64. And Lincoln actually, he expected he would lose the election and not be reelected. He met with his cabinet apparently in August of 64 to discuss the probability of defeat and to make a pact that they would do everything possible to win the war before the Democrats took power. And the Democratic nominee was George B. McClellan. And this guy and Lincoln, as we know, they did not get along. And he was a attractive candidate for the Democrats as the war was suffering, especially as well. It's going poorly. Like, let's get this general here. Between summer and the election, the U.S. military won a series of victories: Atlanta, Shenandoah Valley, Mobile Bay, and those victories propelled Lincoln and the Republicans back into office. Fall of 64. And we said this election was a referendum on the war, emancipation. By voting Republican, Northern voters showed their support for seeing the struggle through on to the end. But this was a close election, though. It wasn't a landslide. In many ways, the participation of soldiers, some of whom were given furloughs to vote. And so many soldiers voted for Lincoln, like something like 80%. And doing so, they were saying that they should finish the war. They voted for McClellan. It was a vote to go home. The Democratic platform was actually calling for an immediate ceasefire. 64 marked for the first time that a national election was held during a war, like a major war as well. It was a remarkable testament to the vitality, we'll say, of the democratic system here. We look forward to seeing how the election of 2020 will go, given the world that we live in now, right? And of course, the Confederacy was curious about what was going to go on in this election of 64. And they believed that if they could hold on to that point, the Democrats won, they still might win their independence. So it was a very important election, just like as we spoke, the election of 1800. Back to this, the Northern economy, very successful during the war. Lost businesses with the South, but was made up for by the demand for war-related materials, clothing, feeding the army, arming them. 2 million men were situated, stimulate the soldiers. The 2 million men were fighting, were stimulating the economy, as well as agriculture. The North produced more wheat in 62 and 63 than the whole country had ever produced. Corn, beef, pork production all increasing, and this despite the absence of about 1/3 of the labor force who were in the army. Recent technologies such as reapers, mowers, rakers, etc., making agriculture much more efficient and productive. Other tech, let's see, canning things that you can see here. This condensed milk there, canning fruits and other types of food, Borden's condensed milk that we see here. They were making something like 17,000 quarts a month in 62, and a year later they're making about 17,000 quarts in a day, most of which is going down to the soldiers. Transportation's dramatically expanding, railroad mileage are extending, the systems themselves were improving. In the North, while it's just completely falling to pieces down the South, the largest single rail network in the world was the United States military railroad. So the mechanism in factories sped up production to a variety of industries such as shoemaking, firearms. The sewing machine was put to use on wide scale. There's a need. It's the first time ever like the standardized clothing and and shoes to serve the needs of the army, and everything before was made to wear. Like, not made to wear. I'm sorry, it was tailored. But now companies like, say, Brooks Brothers, or they this is a small, a medium. You're 15 and a half by 32 arm, something like that, which is my size. And actually, I'm a 33 arm. Um, what else, though? This is just a shift in wealth toward the North. And while the South was just in ruins by 65, the northern states were healthy, we were growing, and that disparity continued for a long time. You can argue still continues today. But the Republican agenda with the war really went underway fast. Republicans were unable to enact many pieces of legislation of agenda that they've been pushing since their formation in the mid 1850s, and with all these Southern congressmen out of the way, they could do things they'd wanted to do for so long. Free labor and capitalist growth. And they're looking toward a national banking system, wanted to create a national fiscal and monetary system. The existing system at this time was very chaotic, slowed the flow of commerce. And so they passed the National Bank Act of 1863, which provided for a chartered national bank that could issue a national currency. So this was a good thing. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of free government land to anyone who had lived on the land for 5 years. Eventually, 80 million acres were given out under the Homestead Act. People were just moving west. Land Colleges Act of 1862 gave each state an amount of federal lands to establish new universities. A&M, agriculture and mechanical colleges. This was like the single most important piece of education legislation in U.S. history. Many of the great public universities in the United States were established under this act. So here in Louisiana, obviously LSU, probably most famously in California, the University of UC Berkeley. That was a land grant. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 provided for building a transcontinental railroad, which was a long time dream of Republicans linking. In the end, this was often shot down by Southern members of Congress, but now it provided government grants and incentives to railroad builders. Government grants provided for each mile of the road 6,400 acres of land and $16,000 in federal loans for each mile being built. And those numbers also increased over time. So 120 million acres of government land given to the railroad companies. All of this legislation furthered the growth of modern capitalism. The national banking system, a stable currency, federal aid for railroads that would continue to further develop in the West, land grant colleges that would train students to be better farmers, better engineers, and free land for farmers that gave them the most essential asset to start farming, right? Land. And all of these things, from the Republican point of view, push forward an agenda that would make the U.S. economy stronger. And the ability of the North to fight this enormous war and still have this incredible prosperity produced great optimism throughout the North. When the war ended, it seemed like the sky was the limits, right? This attitude was in stark contrast to the gloom and doom of the South. And I have not mentioned this third group of people involved in this war yet today, the ones who this 4-year war was waged over in the first place, enslaved people. And one of the most important changes in the military situation came after 1863 as Black men began to serve in U.S. armies. Water break. Nearly 200,000 African Americans served in the U.S. military. And the recruitment really began in 1863, and many Northerners came to support the use of black soldiers, even Democrats, but also on very racist grounds. So it was better for black soldiers to be put in harm's way. Others realized this was a tremendously effective tool against the rebels. Every black soldier who came out of slavery not only had a gun, was also denied that labor to the CSA. Their labor was gone. They're losing twice. African American soldiers faced a struggle for equal treatment as soldiers. They initially were not paid as much as white soldiers. White soldiers were getting $13 and a clothing allowance a month, and black soldiers were getting $10. There was protests, and the pay scale became equal in '64. The units were segregated, and the officers were white. And this made sense early, as few black men had military experience. But this situation did not change as the war went on. African American units often were not allowed to fight in combat, and they just given menial duties, left to do the kinds of things that enslaved people did for the CSA, building fortifications, roads, etc. A couple major battles, most notably Fort Wagner. Fort Wagner in South Carolina involved the famous 54th Massachusetts, and that battle, for many people at least, changed the perception that African American men could not be used in serious combat. You might have seen the movie Glory from the maybe 90s, Matthew Broderick. Anyway, one other element of black military service was that they were offered no quarter by the CSA. They weren't taken as prisoners of war, usually just executed when captured. So military service became a basis for powerful claims to black citizenship, though. Frederick Douglass pushed very hard for black military service from the beginning of the war. He did so because he believed that their military service would lead to a claim for black citizenship. So, excuse me. The South, the war is bringing dramatic changes to the lives of those still living in slavery, those enslaved people. Slave labor made possible that 80% mobilization among white men in the South. They kept the economy going in the South, while many were assigned to supporting roles in the Confederate Army. Even they worked as cooks, nurses, etc. But behind the lines, the institution of slavery was weakening. And with so many white men in the army, it was impossible to maintain the same level of discipline and control as it had been prior to the war. The disruption of armies, Confiscation Act, Emancipation Proclamation, the process of white people becoming refugees, all these weakened slavery and made it just nearly impossible to maintain any sort of discipline. Enslaved people understood this. White people understood this. Rules are changing. In some cases, enslaved people ended up running the plantations, basically, in which they had worked. And by the end of the war, the Confederacy resorted to putting enslaved people in the Confederate Army as soldiers. There's a lot of debate in 1864 and 65, and in the end, the Congress voted to arm as many as 300,000 enslaved men. They're not going to offer freedom, though, to those who served. But to many folk, this seems like the moment when the CSA had just lost the war. You can see the hypocrisy and problem of using enslaved people to protect a slave holding system. As a quote, "The day you make soldiers of them is the beginning of the end of our revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." So the Civil War was this watershed moment in African American history, obviously. 3.5 to 4 million people were freed in the CSA, another 500,000 freed in the border states. The war established this claim for black citizenship, but there's open questions still. The larger status of African Americans after the war, and this is going to be questions that had to be addressed during Reconstruction. Lincoln's second inaugural, which is one of his most important speeches in March of '65. Gives hints at this. And the first Union regiment that marched up Meeting Street in Charleston was the 21st USCT, a black regiment, and they accepted the surrender of the city from its mayor. And then black soldiers and former enslaved people began to hold ceremonies all around the city. There was a parade throughout Charleston in March of '65. So this idea of black Charlestonians singing John Brown's Body behind Union troops, it's a big parade with two floats, big for them, not for us here, obviously. Had a mock slave auction with a woman and a baby being sold away on this one of these floats. And the next float, though, I'll find an image. No. Yeah, there we go. They had a coffin that they were parading labeled slavery. And it said, Fort Sumner dug its grave, April 12th, 1861. So when the war ended, all these black Charlestonians had this extraordinary ceremony at the fort, and about 3,000 people were there. William Lloyd Garrison was there. That night, there was a banquet on April the 14th. That night, they held this banquet in Charleston. The night, though, that was the night, though, that Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington. And the Confederate Army had turned the Planters Horse Track into an open-air prison. And in this prison, 260 some Union soldiers had died of disease and exposure. There was a ceremony to honor these people here. On May 1st of '65, there was another parade of 10,000 people to this cemetery, led by 3,000 black children carrying roses and flowers, singing John Brown's Body, followed by women and men. Everybody marched all around from the racetrack. I mean, get there, and preachers were reading scripture, and the children's choir sang the national anthem, America the Beautiful, etc. And this is essentially what we still do today call Memorial Day. There are 3 or 4 cities in the U.S., both north and south, that claim to be the site of the first Memorial Day, and every one of them like marks the day beginning the day in 1866. But like in Charleston there, or it's barely over. African Americans basically invented Memorial Day in Charleston in '65, and these people recently freed told the world with their flowers and their singing children that what this war was actually about. They were claiming the war that they were creating, and let me rephrase that. They were claiming the war, and they were creating an independent day of the Second American Revolution. Let's put it like that. Yeah, it's a new Independence Day. Anyway, we'll wrap it up here, and we'll talk again soon.